Hello! I was recently inspired to see if I can try making an explosion out of using just objects in my kitchen and my phone as a recorder. So the end result ended up sounding something like this. And the source for this was my oven door being open and shut, and mortar and pestle being hit together, and my cutlery drawer being open shut. I did also record the mortar and pestle being continuously swirled, though I didn't end up using it in design. Listening back to it now, I think it probably could have been a cool layer to use for the tail. So, diving into the design, I'm gonna go through this layer by layer. First, I'm gonna turn off my bus processing. And for the lead up, the first tracks sounds like this. Now, this was made from the kitchen drawer, and it was slowed down quite a bit by 0.63 playback rate. And I also drew in pitch item automation, so give it a bit of a swooping up effect. So that's cool. Now, raw is what that sounded like. Now, to process this, all I did was some EQ to clean up the low end, and then some very slight filter movement using filterfreak to add an extra movement in the high end. That way it gives an extra swooshing effect, which I thought was cool. Now the next track is where a lot more of the tonal aspect of the lead-up comes from. And this was made from the oven door being open and shut, using just a bit before the transient. It's slowed down by a tad. And then to process this, I use Sitrin to saturate. And then M flanger with the feedback turned up, and this is what's giving the self-oscillation really cool tonal aspect. Pro Q3 to get rid of the low end. Some chorus for some extra movement and stereo width. And then using multipass in their OTT setting. I find this is actually a bit of a sleeper that not too many people use. This version of OTT, in my opinion, sounds super awesome. I find it doesn't give that same like noisy aspect as the OG OTT, though I'm fairly certain to use it in this design still. This is awesome. You could find this in the dynamics section of multipass and OTT. It's awesome. So that's cool. So both of these layers sound like this. And to process these, all I'm doing is some slight EQ to clean up the low end, and then some compression to glue it together. So next up we have the transients. And the first transient is made from my kitchen drawer, being slowed down by a whole ton, which sounds like this. If I were to stretch out the recording, and at its original playback rate, just an ever so slight snippet of it. I'm using this to mimic the slight distortion in air that you get from an explosion. I mean, I'm assuming that's probably what happened. But that very, very sharp moment of your ears piercing and your ears distorting, and just right before the impact, just to make it a bit punchier, a little bit more aggressive. So to make this more exciting, I added a flanger for some ever so slight movement. Tape emulation to tame the high end by a bit and make it a little thicker. Saturation. Some OTT. Transient shaping. Some multi-band compression. some extra saturation transient shaping, some EQ to clean up the low end and a resonance, and then another snap heat preset, which just saturates the whole thing and I think sounds awesome. So next up we have a mortar and pestle being hit together, which sounds like this. Now to spice this up a bit more, first up I'm cleaning the low end again. And I do this a lot because I have some layers that are meant to be occupying that space a bit more. So by having each layer kind of intended to live in the space that I'm hoping that it's going to live in, I think just makes everything a bit cleaner and also gives more room for every element to breathe. So after that, I have some compression to bring out some more attack. Some saturation. Now this is where things get a little funky. On the low band, I just have the drive cranked up. And this is overblowing it by a little bit, which I think sounds pretty cool. Some OTT. And then Pro G. And by gating it, I like using gates for transient material, especially where I have multiple transients back to back. Because instead of using a transient designer to cut off the sustain, using a gate allows me to get almost like a cool gated effect in a way, where I'm getting just like the attack of it, some body, and then the tail is being cut off, which I think is pretty cool. It gives more space for the transient of the next transient element to shine. And both of these are being processed together in a bus. I have some slight EQ, some compression, transient shaping. That was funky. And some clipping. I believe it's a Mark Kilborn trick that I saw a while back with a video we did with Pro Sound Effect on processing guns, where using a transient designer and a clipper allows for you to maintain the punch that you get from a transient designer, but the clipper sort of safeguards it, and you maintain that same punch without overblowing your speakers, and it sounds pretty cool. And I love turning up the soft clip saturation amount, which I think adds some extra body and color to the whole thing. It makes it a little thicker. Next are the punch layers. Now for the first punch layer, we have the oven door. Crazy, slow down by a little bit. And then to process this, I have Pro Q, doing nothing. You're not doing anything. Some transient designing. Some more. Now, what's really cool about using multiple transient designers that are similar is instead of having one work really hard, you can have two of them work semi as hard, so it sounds a bit more natural. Versus. Or I can do that, which I think sounds pretty good. I know I did before I did have it like this. Yeah, that works. Some saturation. OTT. And some clipping. And now this second track is the exact same process chain. However, what I am doing is, especially when I record something that has a lot of variations, is to use, for something that has transients, to use one variation for one transient and a different variation for another transient. So that way they have a bit more of a flair to it. It's not the exact same sound back to back. You get a bit more of a natural rhythm that way, I find. So that's cool. And then processing both of these is just some ever so slight EQ and some compression. Without, just tightens up a little bit, I think. Next are the body layers. Just where things get a little more crazy. So first up is distorted transient layer. Now, all these are created off of a similar guess you could say a philosophy-ish, whatever you want to call it, where I'm taking some source material, processing it a ton, rendering it out, and then I am reprocessing, resampling the process track so I can do some more cool stuff to it. So to start off, I had the mortar and pestle impact, which sounds like this, and it's slowed down to 0.099 if I bring that back to the original play rate. Pretty boring, but slowed way down, which I'm surprised could be heard, given that this was recorded off a phone. And process this is some saturation. Some more saturation. More like overdrive. Some M ratio MB doing the cool ratio and tonal noise thing, where I'm turning down the noise and keeping the tonal elements, which is pretty awesome. Some phases. Now what's cool about this is I have the rate of the phaser parameter modulated by the volume. So that way, as the sound starts, like the transient, the phaser rate is really fast and then it slows down as the sound sustains. And that will be useful, more useful for another layer coming soon. Next, some saturation. Some delay. Filter freak. I think this is a really cool Alex Barnhart trick I saw way back on just making really clean sounding swooshes and a lot of cool movement where the high end doesn't come in the whole time. It's only coming in at the apex of the sound, which is pretty cool. And M ratio MB again. And then Traveler to do cool Dopplerizing. Now the thing with this is I have the duration set incredibly short, 21 frames. And because it's so short, it's just creating some really cool impacts. And I'm not doing anything else with Traveler. So that's that. So I rendered that, and then the end result was this. So that's cool. But I wanted to take that further. And so all I did was some ever so slight EQ to reshape the mids. Compression. Recenter. And stereo to turn down the side channel. Which is cool. So next is this layer. Call it distorted tone. The interesting thing about this is that the source track for this is actually created from similar processing train as before, except I added a whole ton more after the Traveler. And my computer right now doesn't want to let me run this without the whole thing exploding. So I'm just going to quickly show what I did and what that sounded like. So it's after the Traveler from earlier, I did OTT, some more saturation, flange, baby, recenter, Pro Q, OTT, a lot of gain, and then decrackle, which is really cool for making some really weird artifacts. So that rendered out sounded like this. Which is cool. So then I thought, what if I were to speed this up? Because sometimes always slowing things down can get a little boring. So that ended up making a cool little warbly thing like this. Which is kind of weird, I thought. Kind of cool. Up 35 semitones. And I only took a slight sliver of that, which I think gives a nice character to the body. And all I'm doing here is some EQ, compression, and then turning on the side channel. And now the next thud layer, I called it, is the exact same source track that I did. Took it and then processed it and then rendered it out. Except instead of speeding it up, I actually slowed it down by 50%. which sounds like that and is slightly absurd because you can't really hear it too much. However, I found that you're not actually doing anything, and if I distort it with the decapitator, makes a bit of a low thumpy kick-ish thing that's kind of pillowy, if that makes sense. And then some extra EQ. I thought this was kind of a nice, really weird low thump to it that was kind of soft because there's already a lot of transient happening with the punch and transient layers, and even the initial distorted transient. So altogether, that's what the body sounds like. Now to process all these, which is where a bit more character comes in, is flare to add some movement. OTT. This is a favorite. Saturation. Overdrive. Saturation. OG OTT. Pro Q to tame the high end. And Pro G to do that same gating trick that I mentioned earlier. Like without it. Kind of just tightens it up in an ever so slight way that I think sounds pretty clean. So last but not least, well, the hardest part for me is the tail, which in the end sounded like this. Now, for the first layer of the tail, I did that same idea where I heavily processed a track, except this time I took the oven door, slowed it down by a little bit. So to start off, I had some compression, some saturation, some flanger with the feedback turned up to create that cool oscillation effect, some Pro Q to get rid of all the high end and low end, chorus for some movement, and OG OTT once again. So that's fun and cool. So what I did from there was I rendered that out, and then I took that and then I reversed it and slowed it down so it's playing back at 0.099, which I thought made these really weird. So first I saturated that, and I got rid of all the cool low end I just made, and recenter. Now the next element of the tail is a bit more of a traditional tail-ish layer, I guess you could call it, where this is meant to recreate the sound of an explosion happens and then the space is being excited, but then some of those reflections are coming back to you really quickly. So to start off was the infamous oven door, slow down a little bit, compression, transient, transient, saturation, OTT, clipping. You're not actually doing anything. Supermassive. Now what this is doing is I'm parameter modulating the delay time, so it's really slow and then gets faster. I think it's going by an insanely quick time. Yeah. 0 millisecond release. Nice. And I find this gives that really cool effect of all the delays coming towards you really quickly. Pitch shifting. Some delay to mimic some extra chorus-y stuff. And EQ to just keep the high mids. Okay, and then the next layer, which is where I believe it starts sounding more like a tail, was the oven door once again. This time sped up by a tad. And EQ. Compression. ROM. At 100%. And then next up is some timeless to do some slap back echo, some short delays. Adds a cool little chorusy thing. And to go on with the chorus, some dimension D. And then getting rid of the low end. After that, this very scary looking waveform here is the oven once again. but slowed way down. I am surprised this can be heard. Very, very low, thumpy. Kind of impressive for a phone recording. So first thing I did was some EQ, so I'm just keeping the low mids. Some saturation. Pro MB. This is doing a really cool trick I saw from Noah Sitrin, where you're keying basically an upwards expander on the low frequencies based off the mid-range. So that way the low frequencies aren't sustaining for a very long time and making things muddy. Next, some filterfreak doing some crazy filter modulation. And I believe I'm using, op amp. And then Pro C. And altogether, that's what the tail currently sounds like. Not too exciting. So what I did to make it a bit more like a tail, first was add M tremolo to have a really fast tremolo effect that's slowly slowing down the rate. Now this does have a low depth, so it's pretty subtle. And this is probably way too long for how long it's actually sustaining at the moment. Then I have black box for some saturation. Filter Freak doing the clean swoosh thing. And also on op amp. Kilohertz Convolver on the experimental Big Bang. That's what makes it sound a bit more like a space, which I think is cool. I find whenever a lot of times using a convolution reverb at some point in a tail design makes for a more convincing tail. Because it's real recordings, generally. I don't know, but that's just me. Then I have recenter. Filter Freak doing some comb filter movements. And some EQ to get rid of the low end and high end again, because I wanted this tail to be really focused on just the mid range. So that's all cool. So altogether, as of now, this is what it sounds like. Now, to take this further, I did a slightly more aggressive mastering chain than I guess I would have liked. First, some saturation. Getting you there already. And then a effect container that has a starting point for one of my mastering chains that I'll use. First, some EQ. Compression. Multiband compression. Soothe to tame the high end by a bit and any like tonal resonances that poke out a bit too much. Gullfoss to brighten it up and to do some spectral tonal shaping, whatever it does. Pro MB, this is a low mid compression based off of the sub frequencies. So whenever there's sub, this is going to go down. And this is an upwards expander for just the sub frequencies. Next up is Saturn, the worm tape setting. OTT. And then Oxford Limiter, which I find has a really nice sound, especially when you turn the enhance curve up, which might be similar to Inflator. Not entirely sure. I've never A-B'd it. But the input gain is turned up, and I think it sounds cool. So that's cool. And threshold's turned down, so it's actually limiting by a couple dB. So after that, I have the ever so slight bass cleanup. And uber loud to do what I probably could do within this chain, but it's kind of nice to just add it on as an extra one plugin instead of multiple. I am doing a slight bit of denoising, clipping, and I'm using this in multiband mode and the push character. This thing's just great at what it does. It's awesome. So that is how I created an explosion using just the objects in my kitchen and a phone as a recorder. I hope some of this could have been inspiring or useful for some people. I know I learned a lot while creating this. And I just want to say thanks to the community for inspiring me to come up with this design. And I hope to see some more soon for people. Bye for now.